this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Kherson direction, where the Russians continue doing something, because for now it's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening in the Kherson direction, but obviously something huge is brewing. Today we got additional batch of updates from this area. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians destroyed another temporary deployment point of the armored forces of Ukraine with the use of FAB 3000 or FAB 1500. The entire building was reduced to ruins as a result of Russian fire. Furthermore, from the same area we got reports that Ukraine armored forces confirmed the entry of assault groups. There is a fight. The information requires confirmation. So according to pro-Ukrainian sources, during the previous 12 hours, during the previous night, the Russians, most likely of sabotage and reconnaissance group, entered the settlement of Nikolaevka, and that there were very heavy clashes in this area. So this is very interesting because today, for example, it's good to increase the numbers of updates, let's say since the beginning of this month, since the beginning of May, and then everything will become clear. For example, during the previous months, we got lots of reports from the Kinburn Spit that the Russians, according to information we have, are concentrating themselves in this area. The Ukrainians, since the beginning of this month, made lots of attempts to attack the Russian units in this area with the purpose to reduce this concentration. So something interesting is happening here. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous months, the Russians established almost complete control over the islands to the south of Kyzyomys. This was stated by several resources and by several mappers. So this is the situation in this part of the Kherson direction. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to secure islands in front of the settlement by the name of Pridniprovskaya, and several pro-Russian resources reported and several pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed that there was a firefight on the eastern outskirts of the settlement at night. So the Russians have no problems and have free access to this bank, and the Russians have possibilities to maneuver in this part of the Kherson city. So as you can see, this is already the outskirts of the settlement itself. Furthermore, during the previous months, we had huge activities exactly in this pocket. And telling the truth, the main activities and the main concentration of actions is taking place exactly in this area. And exactly from this area, yesterday the Russians published this video where we can see how Russians established another Russian flag in the most northern part of the settlement of Nikolaevka. This flag was established by a drone, but obviously this is something a very, very alarming signal for Ukrainians and of course for us that the Russians are planning to do something. Furthermore, during the previous months, we got reports that during the, for example, 7th of May, the armored forces of the Russian Federation, more precisely the groups of the sabotage and reconnaissance forces, managed to answer the settlement of Burgunka. And as you can see, this settlement is located very far from the Dnipro River, more than 2.5 kilometers. So the Russians currently have possibilities to go deep inside of the territory of Ukrainian-controlled Kherson region for more than 2 kilometers, and this is very huge distance. So we see that Ukrainians have problems with forces. Furthermore, once again today we got report that the Russians almost secured the village of Nikolaevka. We see and understand that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are trying to reduce official data from this area. The Ukrainians don't want to have panic from this situation. The Ukrainians still believe that the river of Dnipro is able to slow down the Russians and not so allow them to have a very powerful stronghold, very powerful foothold on this side of the river. The Russians from their side don't want to probably reveal some very important information about the situation in this region. So anyway, we'll keep an eye on this area because we expect that something huge may happen in this area in the very, very near future. Because now we have more and more talks from different sources that the Russians either have already launched their summer major offensive operation or about to do this. Another important batch of updates are coming from the city of Kiev. According to information we have, during the previous night, the Russians carried out massive drone strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians launched more than 270 drones, and the Ukrainians managed to bring down up to 88 drones. According to Ukrainians, 128 failed to reach targets. So obviously the biggest, let's say, attack from the Russian side. And during the previous night, we got lots of videos where we can see the work of Ukrainian air defense and the work of Russian drones of Geran type. In this video, for example, we can see the drone of Geran itself flying above Kiev, and we see Ukraine attempts to bring this drone down. And in the final minutes, in the final seconds of this video, we can see how Ukraine air defense rocket managed to bring Russian drone down. So the situation here is very difficult, and it's very interesting to see what is going to happen next.
Velkommen til Andersen og Martini. I dag skal vi ud og køre i lidt af et ikon inden for bilverden, en Mini Cooper.
Now let's move to the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and first let's talk about the Bogatyr direction. Once again, I'll remind you that according to information we have, yesterday the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Bogatyr. Lots of flags were raised by the Russians in this area, and now everybody is laughing at the pro-Ukrainian source Deep State, because if you remember yesterday they reported that the units of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade counterattacked the settlement of Bogatyr and restored complete control over this territory. Now everybody understand that reports published by the 33rd Brigade were just a fake. So today the Russians continue offensive operation, and we start receiving reports that the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Odradne. The Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement, and most likely the clashes are going to take place very soon. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources made several adjustments on their maps, and telling the truth, according to several very reliable resources, the Russians are already in several meters from the outskirts of the city of the village itself. According to geolocations, we have that the Russians managed to improve their positions just in the southern part, but the Russians we see are shortening the distances to the village itself. The clashes for the village of Odradne is going to start very, very soon. When talking about the northern flank, according to information we have, during the previous nights, the Russians managed to improve their positions on their way in the direction of the northern part of Alexeyevka. We discussed the situation several times. Now we see that the Russians are trying to advance from this area with the purpose to get as close as possible to the village of Alexeyevka itself and to attack this village from the north. Now let's talk about the city of Pokrovsk. Today several neutral mappers adjusted their maps, and this is approximately the situation on the ground. I'll remind you that during the previous days we were talking a lot that the Russians improved their positions in the southwestern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and today we got first proofs that this exactly happened. So according to several neutral mappers, the Russians managed to answer the city of Pokrovsk itself. We are talking about, of course, first of all, agglomeration and villages that are located basically inside of the city itself. So we see that the Russians continue offensive, and that the situation here is also very difficult. When talking about the eastern flank, during the previous 24 hours, we got additional proofs of Russian control over the settlement of Nova Poltavka. I'll remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources reported that the village of Nova Poltavka was completely captured and secured by the Russians, and most of the mappers from the Russian side adjusted their maps in the northern part of the village and in the western part of the village as well. But when talking about geolocations, we still have some doubts whether the Russians managed to take the entire village under complete control. For example, in this video we can see how Russian soldiers were establishing the Russian flag in the most southern and in the central part of the settlement. This flag was geolocated, and this is exactly the place where the Russians established their flag. And this is another episode that was published during the previous night. In this video we can see the central part of Nova Poltavka with Russian flag, but as you can see in this video we can't see even a single Russian soldier, which means that when the Russians were establishing their flag in this point, it was still very, very dangerous to be outside or to be on the let's say open air, because most likely Ukrainian drones were flying these. So this is the reason why we believe that most likely the northern part and the western parts of the settlement of Nova Poltavka are still under complete Ukrainian control. But once again, according to several pro-Russian resources, this entire area by the morning of the 18th of May of 2025 have been already captured by the Russians and secured completely. So everything inside of this red line is already under the Russian control, according to several pro-Russian resources, but as for now we don't have proofs for this. When talking about the Kleban-Byksky pocket, we have changes, we have lots of updates. Probably the third day in a row, we are receiving updates that the Russians answered the southeastern and the eastern part of Romanovka. Several sources reported this information yesterday. There are very heavy clashes for this village. The Ukrainians are trying to show significant and fierce resistance with the purpose to save control over the village for as long as possible. And the main reason of this is that Ukrainians still haven't managed to finish finish the evacuation from the southern part of the pocket. If Ukrainians lose control over Romanovka, the Ukrainians that are currently located in the southern part of this pocket would be caught in cauldron without any possibilities for evacuation. So that is why the Ukrainians, without counting losses, are sending more and more units in the direction of Romanovka with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to save control over the settlement for as long as possible. When talking about the southern part of the pocket, we got reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern part of the village of Stara Nikolaevka. This information was confirmed both by several mappers and by this video, where we can see how Russian vehicle was entering the village of Stara Nikolaevka from the south. So let's discuss this video in details. This video was published yesterday, but just today we found another geolocation from this area. So we will discuss this point, and this is exactly the moment that we are talking about. So in this video we can see Russian vehicle, and this is exactly the place where the Russian vehicle was geolocated. So you can see lots of things, and the Russians, which means managed to improve their positions and to take under control buildings in this part of the settlement. So the Russians continue advancing, and most likely a turning point in the battle for Stara Nikolaevka probably occurred. When talking about the Konstantinovka direction, today the main activities updates about the main activities are coming from these pockets along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. So in this video we can see how Ukrainians were after withdrawing Russians, Ukrainians from the 28th Brigade were attacking Russians along canal, and based on this video we have adjusted the map by coloring these trenches and this dense network of the fortification in Russian favor. Furthermore, today we got reports that the Russians continue advancing and are about to take under complete control the settlement of southern Deliivka. So we expect that during the next 48 hours the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation or another Russian group of forces unit will publish video with Russian flags in this area. So the Russians are about to finish the battle for the southern part of this pocket along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. At the same time, we got reports that the Russians continue bombing and attacking next 3 lines in this area with the purpose to prepare 3 lines and prepare routes of attacks for Russian assault groups. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Liman direction. We have lots of very important updates. The situation in the settlement of Tarskoye is still unclear. It's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening here. One thing we know for sure, that the Russians moved their focus further in the direction of the settlement by the name of Zarechne. For example, during the previous months we received a lot of videos and articles from the settlement of Tarskoye, and now we stop receiving anything, which means that the Russians moved their focus, and probably due to the situation that the village is in the complete Russian control. So in these videos we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian vehicles and tanks and positions in the area of Zarechne. Furthermore, the Russians on the northern flank of the Liman pocket of Liman breakthrough continue advancing in the direction of the village by the name of Grekovka. Today, as you can see, we got additional geolocations that confirm additional progress on the ground. In this video we can see how Ukrainians using FPV drones were attacking Russian units in this area. This video contains several geolocations and several episodes, and two episodes were geolocated. One of Ukrainian attack was geolocated exactly in this point, another Ukrainian attack with drone was geolocated exactly in this point. Based on this video, we came to the conclusion that the Russians are moving further in the northern direction using the broad front line attack. Now let's talk about the northern regions, and today the most interesting updates are coming from the Kharkiv region, from the Kharkiv direction. For example, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians published this video. This video was published, as you can see, by the 58th Motor Rifle Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian units and Russian soldiers in this area. And the most important detail of this video is that Ukrainians were attacking not static positions of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation, but Ukrainians were attacking vehicles and tanks of the armored forces of the Russians in this direction. Lots of infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, just regular vehicles and cars were damaged and destroyed by the Ukrainians, which means that the Russians tried to carry out a full-scale offensive operation with the purpose probably to get as close as possible to the settlements of Vysokoye Ruga, Alexeyevka, Goptovka, Kudiivka, probably even in the direction of Kazachye Lopuny. And you know that if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning, let's say of 11th of May, we're gonna see very very huge activities of the Russian units and the Russian forces in this region. So we just discussed Russian attempts to attack here, but for example, several days ago, more precisely on the 17th of May, we got another video where we can see not just another attempt from the Ukrainian side to repel Russian attack, but we can see a video where we can see a huge convoy of Russian units that were heading and approaching towards the border with Ukraine, and several units managed to enter the territory of this Russian control area. So we see something huge is brewing in this area, and we expect that due to this concentration of forces that the Russians would try to create secure zone in this region as well. So the situation is very interesting. We see that the Russians are not interested in any talks, peace talks. The Russians have their own demands, and until Ukrainians accept these demands, the Russians most likely will continue their offensive operation. Furthermore, we had reports that most likely the Russians are not going to return back to the negotiation process until October of 2025, because the Russians know that they have prepared everything for summer offensive operation, which most likely have already started. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world.